All right, so we're continuing our series we started, The Lies I Learned at Home, and I decided that I would pick kind of a lighthearted lie every single week. And just to give you an example of how much we believe lies, a couple of weeks ago I shared that we have a tendency to believe that if we allow our kids to have too much sugar or we feed them sugar that they'll be hyperactive. And I showed that there's been double-blind tests that that's a lie, it's not true. But just the other day, I was telling a family member that that's not true, and boy, they started to disagree right away, almost an argument. Well, I do this with my kids, and I've seen this, and the only reason I share that, if we have that hard a time letting go of lies that I can just say, hey, science shows this, and it's not even that big a deal, think about how difficult it is to let go of lies that we really hold on to. So, for this week, looking at, for the lies I learned at home, I picked this one. Cracking your knuckles will give you arthritis. And how many of us learned about that growing up? And really, the data shows this. There is no raised risk of arthritis in the knuckle crackers. Now, with time, you can lose your grip, but basically, that is a lie, and I have the source up there. So, moving on, so why do we believe lies? And you can jump on previous YouTube messages and subscribe to that. I would recommend that for Region and Abundant Life. But the reason this becomes so difficult, and we've talked about this in past weeks, is number one, the description or the title that really resonates the most with me when thinking about Satan is he's called the father of lies. And so when you just really think about that concept, it's almost like lies are his children. And that when you think about having an enemy in your life, his most successful tactic will be the lies we believe in our life. Number two was this: we are born into a world system that lies to us. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, shares that in Ephesians chapter 4, and the idea is that we be no more children tossed to and fro by men waiting to deceive us and things like that. But the idea is this: we are born into a world that will continually lie to us. That could be through the people in our lives, that could be through the media, that can be through systems we see around us, that can be through education, any area. But this is a world that does continually lie to us. And finally, we lie to ourselves. And that's sometimes the most difficult one to get across to ourselves, meaning this: we have this thing called a flesh or a sarx. So if we didn't have that, we would just come to church, and then the pastor, let's say Pastor Phil, he gets up and says, you know what, you believe this your whole life, that you're not loved. Well, look here, John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world. Hey, you're in the world, you're loved, and you should be better. You should be able just to believe that intellectually, move right on with your life, and not be stuck in the lies. But you have to realize this. There's something in you called your flesh. I said a sarx, and the reality is that has a predisposition to reject God's truth. It's a predisposition to not live according to God's law of love and his desire for your life, and it is strong. That's why you could be talking to somebody and you might see clearly that they're deceived by a lie, but the reality is they don't see it. So I give you the extremes. I work in the counseling field. You could be dealing with somebody with an eating disorder or anorexia, and they look thin, they look healthy, or they look abnormally thin, not in a healthy way. And you could be having the conversation with them about, this is a control issue, a disease, a disorder like that. But they literally would look in the mirror and they don't see it. That's the reality of how strong your flesh is. So, when we began the series, I wanted to emphasize that if you go down this path with a lot of people, we don't want to be remiss in not realizing that some of us grew up in homes where it was beyond just deception and lies. It could have been outright abuse. It could have been neglect at a level that we do not even comprehend. A lot of us in this room, but some of you have experienced that. So sometimes I'm lighthearted, I make a joke, and the reality is we all grew up in homes where we learned some lies, but I never want to be remiss that some of us have gone through what would truly constitute trauma. And I just want you to know that, before I put this next slide up here, that sometimes reconciliation is not the best thing. Sometimes hard boundaries are the separation from people who have hurt you in that way. Although you need to forgive yourself, you're not going to be in a relationship with them again. And so I want to say that. But I will say this. In counseling, we use this terminology, blame. So what is blame? Because you could go through something like the lies I learned at home and, I blame my mom, I blame my dad, I blame my family of origin. Blame, a drug we take to make us feel better, that ruins our lives. And as you go through region and you're in your group and you're going through inventory and steps 3 and 4 and things like that, you can't get stuck in blame. Because the reason we blame is to feel better, but blame will ruin your life. And blame will keep you stuck. So, moving on, this week I'm going to talk about what I would like to call the most controversial lie. Now, it won't seem like that at first. But when I start talking about this issue or this lie, I promise you I get the most pushback, the most questions. And the reason is not only is this a lie that we learn at home often, this is a lie that's permeated at church. A lie that's permeated at church. And so what is the lie? I'm safe when I don't talk about how I feel. I'm safe when I don't talk about how I feel. I have a friend who pastors a church over in Kansas. He's a good friend of mine. And he really is a friend. And I can remember years ago, we were having a discussion, and he really didn't have any sort of a counseling center at his church or a counseling ministry. And he would say, you know what I tell people is if they come in to see me as the pastor, I would say, I'll meet with you 3 times. And if I can't help you, you know what? I'm going to send you off to a counselor. And I kind of joke, and I said this, well, it's funny. If people have gone to church their whole life, and they've gone to hear their pastor, I'll say this, go hear your pastor 3 times. And if you're not totally fixed, come see me. The reason I say that is I feel like with a lot of churches and the way healing and the gospel and sanctification is presented, it's like emotions are the bad guy. Emotions are the things we don't talk about. Emotions are the things that are not helpful. So, I've taught you in the past, if you want to look at why you're deceived or why you're stuck in a lie, you always have to look for the payoff, meaning this, we don't just try to believe lies. Now, sometimes I might believe something that's not true, but as soon as somebody tells me something that is true about that, I just believe that. There's no benefit for me continually to believe the lie. But if we're stuck, meaning if we're stuck in the sense that we can't get out of the lie, I believe even at a subconscious level, even with our flesh, the reality is this, we get a payoff. There's a benefit. Now, I'm going to be clear on this. The benefit's not profitable. The benefit's not healthy. But if you can understand that it's there, it will help. So what is the payoff for not talking about our feelings? Number 1, we can avoid painful feelings. Now, I'm not like there's good emotions or bad emotions, because some people say, happiness is a good emotion, sadness is a bad emotion. No, the Bible talks about sadness being a great emotion, and it's better to go into the house of mourning than the house of joy and things like that. So it's not good emotions, bad emotions, but some emotions are more enjoyable to feel. I think we know that. I think we would all rather be happy than sad. I think we would all rather be joyful than fearful, okay? But when I don't talk about my feelings and I discount them, it is a way for me to avoid them. At least I think I can. Now, the reality is, as you learn in region, they come out in other ways, but that's what we think. Number 2, I can avoid vulnerability. I can tell you what happened in my life. I can tell you what happened at work today. I can tell you what's happening in my marriage. But if I never tell you how I feel about any of that, I'm not really opening up and being vulnerable. Somebody could see that. I went to work today and I got fired and I came home. What happened to work today? I got fired. Well, you really shared something. I didn't really share anything. Anyone who was at work today knew I got fired. It's when I share how that made me feel that I'm vulnerable. So why don't we talk about it? So we don't have to be vulnerable. Next after that, at the end we can avoid danger. Meaning the reason we learn not to talk about our feelings or consider our feelings and emotions and things like that is we've learned that it's not safe. Maybe you would have been disciplined. Maybe you would have been shamed. Maybe you would have been rejected. Maybe somebody wouldn't have cared. Maybe an expectation would not have been met. But the reality is, the reason we avoid sharing it, and the reason oftentimes we avoid even talking about it, is we think we're safe. So how do we learn this? So basically, when you go through and you're doing an inventory, and this isn't all-encompassing for every family, but here's some basic ones. Number one, you grew up in a home where you were not allowed to be angry or sad. Now, I want to say this because I don't want to be, misrepresenting myself, and I don't want to confuse you or anything like that. So, yes, I have grandchildren, and so am I saying that my grandchildren could just be angry and then scream and slam a door and vandalize the house? No, I'm not saying that. Am I saying that, like my grandchildren at this age, that they could be sad and I'm not, well, how would I say it? They're going to get sad and they're just going to go into their room and sulk for 6 hours and not talk to somebody and come out at the table and pout because they're sad, and I'm going to be okay with that. I'm not in any way suggesting that you still can't correct behavior and feelings and emotions and how we process it. I'm not saying that. But I'm talking about pretty much whenever a child felt sad, it was like, snap out of it. You can do better. People have had it worse. Come on, change your attitude. Or if they're angry, nope, you can't be angry. Go to your room. Go to your room. Get away from people right now. Or basically, I know this is a little cliche, I'll give you something to cry about. Those kind of phrases that sound so innocent. But really what you're saying to that child is you're not allowed to be angry. Number two is you grew up with parents who could not regulate their own emotions. The reason sadness and usually fear and anger and those kind of emotions were not allowed at home is because the adults couldn't regulate their emotions. Meaning if somebody was angry, well, they lost their temper. If somebody was sad, they were majorly depressed. And then they would actually enter into substance abuse or addictions to try to cope with that. But basically, the reason those emotions weren't allowed in children is the adults in the home. They could not regulate their emotions. Number three, they grew up with parents who were afraid to connect with emotions. Maybe they were fearful of being rejected. Maybe they had been rejected as a child in their home. But we'll see as we go through this, emotions are how we connect with people. So somewhere in the parent's life, they got to the point where they were afraid to connect. I'll get hurt. Someone's not really going to like me. Or maybe that's seen as weakness or something that's not ideal. Finally, the fourth one is you grew up with parents who discounted emotions, meaning they were not important things. And I just want to say this because I'm going to get into this in a second. You say, what's controversial about this so far? Just give me a second. A lot of times, if you grew up in very conservative, strict religious traditions of faith or churches, you could have kind of heard this and not even realize what you were hearing. So, I want to begin with just this premise. God is emotive. The Bible is filled with examples that God has emotions. Now, if I were to say to you this, there's going to be resistance. Hey, you know what? God's emotional. If I say that, you're like, oh, I don't like the sound of that. If I think God's emotional, I think kind of like he's out of control or he's being ruled by his emotions. That's not what I'm saying. But I would say this, God's emotional. God is emotive. God has emotions. 50% of your Old Testament is written in Hebrew poetry. Part of that is they were an oral society, and that helped them remember things. But the reality is poetry expresses emotion and passion and feelings. The Bible wasn't just written in narrative. It's important. So I look at a couple of texts here, Hosea 11:8, and I just want you to see how expressive the Bible is when talking about God's emotions. My heart is torn within me, and my compassion overflows. That's pretty expressive about emotions. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. That's the context of the flood. Now, I know those need more explanation in the context. Is God really sorry he made people? But the reality is what it is, expressing the deep emotions. So we have here the emotions of regret. And then at the same time, a positive in the sense of being compassionate, we have the emotion of compassion. When you have these passages, why are they there? Why are they described in Hebrew poetry and then translated into English in our translations? It's literally so you can feel what God feels. The language is so expressive. So the next slide I'm going to put up here, I did not cite this slide, meaning that there's no source up here. But I literally got online and just wrote some things that have to do with emotions and God and things like that. And a plethora of sites come up. When you click on them, you're going to find some of the verbiage that I'm going to share here. So here we go. The Bible is clear. I don't have to be ruled by my emotions. Now, this is the sarcastic side of me, but I want to go, good job, got it. But you hear that a lot. When someone's making a poor choice or a poor decision, we'll literally say, well, they're ruled by their emotions, and you don't have to be. Whenever I hear that, I immediately believe, once again, we're casting emotions in a negative light. Is there ever a time where you would want to be ruled by an emotion? Overcome by it? You know, I grew up in church. Well, let me get the other two, and then I'll kind of share on this. The next one is this. Live by the Spirit, not emotions. Now, I'm taking this right off websites, religious websites. That would be Bible-believing websites, but this is the verbiage they use. When I see live by the Spirit, not emotions, and then if you read longer, they would say, we're not supposed to live by our emotions, but by the fruit of the Spirit. And then it starts listing the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace. Wait a second. And I know what someone says, well, you know, love, it's not an emotion, it's a verb, and all of these things. But the reality is, don't live by your emotions, but instead have love and joy. Do you see the inconsistency? And when you start down that path, literally, once again, now emotions are set as different from the Spirit. Be somebody who's led by the Spirit. Don't be somebody who's led by emotions. And I get that, but at the same time, you're implying that emotions are somehow the opposite of God and the Spirit. The final one I heard all the time, it actually is the title of books. I went and pulled an old book that I used to have. And it basically had the Christian life. Number one, you got to get the facts, which is the Bible. Number two, you have to have faith. And then number three, the feelings will naturally follow. Now here's the problem with that. Number one, when it comes to the Bible and facts, well, you know what? I've already showed you that a lot of the Bible and the facts in the Bible contain a lot about emotions and feelings and expressions of that. Number two, when it comes to faith, what you do is you regulate faith to just some intellectual, I believe that. And I won't even get into how reductionist the idea of facts are. Aletheia is the Greek word for truth in the New Testament. A lot of times when people say, we're a church that stands for the truth, what I really hear them say is, you're a church that stands for facts. We wonder why children walk away from the faith a lot. If all they got at church was propositional theology of facts, and then we're told to believe these to be true and that they're going to be okay, that is so reductionist and theologically bankrupt. You don't even want to get me started. The reality is our emotions are interwoven through all of this. And if you did go down that course, you're probably producing robots, not disciples of Jesus. These things are regularly put out all the time, and that's why the lie, especially if you learn it at home, is so powerful. I put up this as a way to just kind of express it in the end. The lie is this. The emotions are always associated with our flesh. So if I'm an emotional person, well, I'm in the flesh. And then on the other side, well, if I'm in the Spirit, I'm a cognitive person. Now, I will share this. I remember when I was a freshman in high school, and the reason I'm going to share this story is this band got back together, and all it did was remind me how old I am, because I saw how old they are. Some bands are so old they shouldn't get back together. Just let me remember you when you were young and listen in my car. The reality is this. The band was Petra, And they were the band that was really, for the first time, making what they call Christian rock. And the reason I remember them is they were actually decent at it, because most Christian rock bands just ruined rock and roll. They weren't any good at all. But the reality is, I thought Petra was decent. So I went to the concert, and I enjoyed it because I grew up on music. And, Petra was probably better than the other stuff I was listening to, which was Metallica and AC/DC. So I went to a Petra concert. I was there with two other friends, and the two other friends were so offended by the music, they got up and walked out of the concert and left me in there. I'm a freshman. Well, I had to go with them because I couldn't drive and I couldn't get home. Immediately, we all got in the car, and like I said, I grew up in church, and they drove me to our youth director, our youth pastor's house. And we asked him, is Christian rock okay? And I never forgot, at the next Bible study, he answered the question, and he said this: certain music just kind of ministers to your spirit, but that kind of music ministers to your flesh. And it sounded so good, but even then, at 14, I said, that's not true. So somebody's listening to opera or a symphony, are they not moved emotionally? So here's the reality. I'm cognitive in my head enough, but when I come to church and I hear worship music, I want to be moved emotionally. It's not like the spirit in me. I'm making a cognitive choice and choosing to worship God. I want to be brought to tears. I want to be moved with passion. I want to experience sadness and joy and all of those things. That is the spirit as well. It's not the flesh. So what is the truth? I'll give you this. Because when somebody says you don't want to be controlled by your emotions, here's how I would explain it. Our emotions are great teachers. About what? God, yourself, others. Well, I'm not going to listen to your emotions. It's like going to school and not listening to the teacher. Well, your emotions lie to you. Your flesh lies to you. Your emotions aren't lying to you. I feel happy. You're not really happy. I feel happy. You're not. That's a lie. Oh, I thought I was happy. I feel sad. You're not really sad. That's just in your head. No, I kind of think I am sad. No, you're not sad. Those emotions lie to you. You're not sad. Well, how about this? I'm really anxious. I have anxiety. No, you don't. You don't have anxiety. That's a lie. Your emotions are not lying to you. But what they don't do well, and this is the next one, our emotions are not always great leaders. So here's the cliche one, but the reason I'm going to go have an affair on my spouse is because I don't feel loved by my spouse and I'm in love with another person. Well, the reality is you might very well not be feeling in love with your spouse. That is something you should listen to and figure out and let God teach you through that. And you might feel like you're in love with somebody that's not your spouse. You need to process that, and you need to see what that's teaching you. But the decision to leave your spouse and have an affair or something like that, that ain't your emotions, that's your flesh. Don't blame your emotions for your choices. Your emotions are great teachers, but not always great leaders. So what is our flesh? It's influenced by a great many things, but it never makes the right choice. If it's your flesh, it is not going to choose to follow God. By nature, by definition, your flesh is opposite of God. So what do? You learn what God desires you to learn, that He will teach you through your emotions. So this will be the part of it that's kind of nerdy today that I like, but here we go. This is a book called Anatomy of the Soul by Kurt Thompson. I actually recommend this book to students in introduction theology at the counseling classes I teach. But I like this quote here at the beginning. Being known. Our Western world has long emphasized knowledge, factual information, and proof over the process of being known by God and others. I want that to sink in. Our Western world has long emphasized knowledge, factual information, and proof. A lot of times when I hear churches talk about truth, or they want to have a class on apologetics, which I like, I do. But when it's just about facts, that is not the emphasis of the Bible or God. But that's what we want when we're purely intellectual and not emotional. What God really wants is us to be known by God and others. He goes on to say this. Yet it is only when we are known that we are positioned to become conduits of love. And it is love that transforms our minds, makes forgiveness possible, and weaves a community of disparate people into the tapestry of God's family. The gospel is not merely, Jesus did this, you're bad, you're going to hell, he died, believe this, and that's true. It's not just some propositional theology or a list of facts that I intellectually assent to. It is about allowing the gospel to show me where I need to be known by God and known by other people. That's the driving force. I like this passage because this is the verse that's so often quoted, and I love it. And in counseling, if we didn't believe this, we wouldn't even have a profession. And you know what? If you're here in Region and you're here tonight, literally as you go step through step through step, you know what's happening through this process? Your mind's being renewed. So Paul says this, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Meaning it is essential for your life to be transformed, which is why we're in Regen, for our mind to be renewed. But oftentimes I feel in religious circles, and when you were taught at home not to talk about how you feel or not to process how you feel, you grew up in a home like that, they were cutting off half of your brain. What do I mean by that? If you look up here, this is kind of a quick summary, but it's about left brain versus right brain. And I know this is oversimplification, but it will prove the point. Left brain, logic, analytical thinking, numbers, and language. And if I were just to, take a poll of the people listening, it would be this. Are you a left brain person? And I think some of us would say, well, we're both, but yeah, predominantly I'm left brain. And I feel like a lot of times the teaching at church and how we grow up in a family, it lends itself to just that. Just believe this to be true about yourself intellectually, and then you'll be free. It's very left brain. But also, when you think about the mind and what needs to be renewed, on the right, expression, emotional intelligence, imagination, creativity, the things that can get stifled. The reality is, to the degree which you interact with both sides of your brain and allow God to renew both sides of your processing in your mind, is a degree to where you will be healthy. A lot of times, moms will come. I say a lot of times, sometimes. And they'll say, I wish that my son would tell me more about his day at school. What they're really saying is, I wish I knew how he felt. What happened today at school? Same thing that happened yesterday. I went to school, I sat under a teacher, you know what? I learned some stuff, I got on a bus, I came home. It's the same every day. What do you really want from the child? The creative part, the sharing part, the emotional part. Well, how will that help that young man? One day when he grows up and he's married, if that's God's plan, he can actually connect with other people and his wife, because we connect when we attach feelings and emotions to our what? To our stories. When we cut that off or we see it as something bad, we hurt ourselves. The left brain's mental processing disregards the right brain emotional elements of trust that are necessary for life to thrive. When I know that I know something because I can logically prove it, I step away from trust. When I no longer trust, I am no longer open to being known, to relationship, to love. We say, change how you think, it'll change how you live. That's kind of true, but here's the reality. My behavior is not really determined by what I think. It's more determined by what I believe. And that's different. 1 Corinthians 8, 1-3 says this, now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if any man thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this is known by him. The goal is to live in authentic relationships with God and other people. So what do you do with emotions? First of all, love them. Second of all, talk about them. I'll give you some keys to run through. Number one, our emotions are key to attaching and connecting with God and others. What about the bad emotions, especially sadness, fear, and despair? I could tell you something good that happened to me in my life, and you could say, that happened to me too. I could say, I remember I went on vacation once to France. I've done that too. Hey, we have something in common. But if I share with you my dad has dementia, that's very painful, and you can say, me too, that's when attachment and connection happens. Number one, feel them deeply. A lot of the reasons we struggle, we compartmentalize our emotions. We try to medicate our emotions. We try to pretend our emotions aren't there, or we don't regulate them. I'll get that in a second. But you do have to feel them. Number two, understand what they teach you. I'm not saying they're the great leaders in your life, but you do need to understand what they are telling you. They're God's gift to you. Number three, regulate them according to the Spirit. It doesn't mean that I am always following what I think they're telling me. It doesn't always mean that I don't have to regulate them and that I don't have limitations in the expression. And there is such a thing as oversharing. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying you do allow the Spirit of God to regulate them, and you learn to do that. And finally, understand with this, you will connect with others through them. The ultimate goal is when you can do that, and we talk about this often, you will be able to love the family of God well, love your family of origin well, love the unreached well, love the least of these well, and love your enemies well. Let's pray. Lord, I just thank you for the gift of emotions. It is really what sets us apart in one sense as being in your image. I pray that people who are here who perhaps grew up in a home where emotions were never discussed, or they were discounted, or they were not allowed to have them, or not allowed to talk about them, or they grew up in churches where they were always seen as antithetical to the Spirit and something to be squashed and diminished. I pray that they would learn to live fully going through Regen, and they would learn to believe your truth and to feel deeply about you and others and be known by others in you. We ask all this in Christ's name. Amen.